Midnight in a level 5 blizzard, and the HOA president is pounding on my door demanding I surrender my grandfather's cabin for her emergency shelter program. Then she calls 911 claiming there's a child trapped inside my home. Red and blue lights cutting through the snow, her nephew wielding a bump key charging my front door. That's when I fired up my laptop, went live with the property survey, the break-in footage, and let the entire county watch the truth unfold in real time. Drop a comment telling me what state you're watching from and hit that subscribe button for La HOA Karen Stories 88. Tonight, someone's world is about to crumble. The blizzard had been howling across the Colorado Rockies for 6 hours when the pounding started at my cabin door. Through my frosted window, I could see a figure in a bright yellow emergency parka holding what looked like an official sign. My husky ranger lifted his massive head from his spot by the wood stove and started that low rumbling growl that meant serious business was approaching. After 3 tours with the volunteer fire department, I'd learned to trust rangers' instincts about people and situations. I cracked the door just enough to see Karen Dunkirk, HOA president and self-appointed clipboard queen of Black Pine Estates, standing in knee-deep snow with that familiar entitled scowl. Karen was one of those people who discovered small-scale authority and wielded it like a medieval monarch. Behind her weathered face was a woman who had transformed a simple community association into her personal fiefdom, complete with arbitrary rules, surprise inspections, and fees that multiplied like rabbits in springtime. "This is community property now," she announced, shoving the laminated sign toward me. "Emergency shelter program," it read, complete with official-looking seals and authoritative language that would fool most people into thinking it came from actual authorities. "I need your weekend slot, Kevin. We have displaced families from the Valley Road closures." Behind her, 2 black SUVs idled in my driveway, exhaust plumes mixing with the swirling snow. Her nephew Mark stood by the lead vehicle, shifting nervously and avoiding eye contact. The thing about Karen's emergency shelter program was that it had appeared overnight, coinciding perfectly with the worst blizzard of the season and the sudden spike in vacation rental prices that always accompanied weather emergencies. Funny how humanitarian crises always seem to generate revenue opportunities for people like Karen. I'd been hearing whispers around town about property owners being pressured to participate in community emergency programs that look suspiciously like mandatory rental agreements. "This is my home, Karen. And more importantly, it's not in your jurisdiction." I stepped onto the porch, letting Ranger move beside me. His presence alone made Mark take a step backward. "This cabin sits outside HOA boundaries and you know it." That's when I pulled out the ace I'd been saving for months. From beside my door, I unrolled the county plat map and the original deed, both laminated and highlighted in fluorescent yellow. "See this red line? That's your HOA boundary. See this blue dot? That's my property. 200 yards outside your little kingdom." Karen's face went from confident to confused to absolutely furious in about 3 seconds. She snatched at the papers, but I held them firm. "This doesn't matter during an emergency declaration," she stammered clearly, making it up as she went. "State law supersedes property rights when public safety is at risk." The funny thing about entitled people is they always double down when they're caught lying. Instead of backing off, Karen planted that ridiculous emergency shelter sign right in my front yard like she was claiming territory. I waited until her convoy disappeared down the mountain road, then I did something that probably seemed petty but felt incredibly satisfying. I yanked her sign out of the frozen ground and tossed it into my wood stove. As the flames consumed her bogus authority, I couldn't help thinking about how this power play was really about money, not emergency shelter. Karen had been pushing short-term rental restrictions in the HOA for months, claiming they were about community character. But rumors were floating that she was operating her own under-the-table rental network. The first email hit my inbox at 3:15 a.m. Subject line: "Dangerous Animal and Property Violations, Black Pine Estates, Lot 47. The message was a masterpiece of bureaucratic passive aggression, claiming my unregistered aggressive animal posed a threat to emergency responders and that my non-compliant exterior modifications violated community standards. She'd CC'd the entire neighborhood, the county sheriff, and the state emergency management office. The whole thing reeked of desperation. By 7 a.m., Karen was back with reinforcements. 4 people this time, including a guy who looked like he'd stepped out of a militia recruitment poster. They called it an inspection, but it felt more like a shakedown. Karen led the charge with her eternal clipboard, now accompanied by a camera and what she claimed was a community safety assessment checklist. The wind was whipping so hard that her clipboard flew out of her hands and nearly took out the big guy who slipped on my icy steps. I had to grab his arm to keep him from tumbling down the staircase. "Careful there, partner," I said, steadying him. "Wouldn't want you getting hurt during your unauthorized visit to private property." The irony wasn't lost on anyone, and I caught Mark smirking before Karen shot him a look that could freeze antifreeze. That's when I noticed something interesting on Karen's clipboard. Among her official-looking forms was a handwritten note with terms like weekend slot availability and emergency rate adjustment. Not exactly the language you'd expect from a genuine humanitarian relief effort. The real game changer came from Josh Klein, my neighbor on the ridge. His property sat just inside HOA boundaries, so he'd been dealing with Karen's escalating demands for months. Around noon, his voice crackled through my CB radio with news that shifted everything. "Kevin, you need to know. People down here are getting fed up with that email Karen sent. Half the neighborhood thinks she's gone too far with this emergency shelter nonsense. Word is spreading that she's been marking properties for some kind of rental scheme." Josh's information network was legendary in our area. As a retired telecommunications engineer, he maintained contact with everyone from local emergency services to county officials. She's been telling people that emergency declarations give the HOA authority to commandeer properties, but Mrs. Henderson called the county emergency management office this morning. They said they never authorized any community shelter programs and HOA emergency authority doesn't exist in county law. That evening, as I sat by my wood stove watching the snow pile higher, I realized this wasn't just about my cabin anymore. Karen's aggressive overreach had awakened something in the community, and not in the way she'd intended. Her attempt to use emergency declarations and fake community authority was starting to backfire. People were beginning to ask questions about where their HOA fees were really going, why emergency protocols seemed to benefit Karen's inner circle, and how a simple community association had gained authority to commandeer private property. I could feel the momentum shifting, but I also knew Karen well enough to know she wouldn't back down easily. If anything, being challenged would make her more dangerous. People like Karen don't handle loss of control gracefully, and I had a feeling the next phase would escalate beyond simple property disputes into something much more serious. The next morning brought evidence that Karen wasn't giving up quietly. Someone had been near my propane tank during the night, leaving drag marks in the snow that led from the tree line directly to my outdoor storage. More concerning was the CB radio chatter I'd picked up around 2 a.m. Voices claiming to be from a community safety team were discussing welfare checks and property inspections with coordinates that matched my location exactly. This wasn't random vandalism. Someone was conducting organized reconnaissance, and they were using official-sounding language to coordinate it. The radio traffic included references to occupancy verification and emergency acquisition protocols. It sounded like military terminology, but when I cross-referenced the frequencies with official emergency services, there was no record of any community safety team. Karen was escalating from fake bureaucratic authority to fake paramilitary operations. I spent the morning turning my cabin into something between a documentary film set and a very polite fortress. First came the early warning system, a network of fishing lines strung between trees with aluminum pie pans that would clatter like a dinner bell factory if anyone approached from the woods. The system was designed to be non-lethal, non-damaging, and highly effective at announcing unwanted visitors while providing audio evidence. Then I installed motion-activated bells from Ranger's old training collar along the main access points. These weren't tinkling wind chimes, but serious working dog equipment designed to be heard across hunting fields. The sound would be subtle enough not to terrorize legitimate visitors, but loud enough to wake me from deep sleep. Each bell was positioned to create overlapping coverage zones, ensuring that anyone approaching would trigger multiple alerts. Finally, I positioned 3 infrared trail cameras at strategic angles around the property, the kind hunters use to track deer patterns. Each camera was synchronized to timestamp everything with atomic clock precision, and I made sure they had clear sight lines to all possible approach routes. The cameras were weatherproof, had night vision capabilities, and were connected to my laptop for real-time monitoring and automatic cloud backup. The first test came from Sergeant Rafael Alvarez and Deputy Miles Moore from the county sheriff's office. They showed up around noon, not in response to any emergency, but to clarify the jurisdictional questions Karen had been raising in her flood of official emails. Alvarez was exactly what you'd want in a veteran cop, thorough, fair, and allergic to bureaucratic nonsense. Moore was younger, more by the book, and clearly skeptical of anyone who'd set up elaborate surveillance around their home. "Mind if we take a look at that plat map again?" Alvarez asked, stepping carefully around my clatterline setup. I appreciated that he'd noticed the fishing line and didn't just blunder through. I spread the county survey across my kitchen table, explaining how the original subdivision had been carved up. "See, my grandfather bought this lot in 1987, 2 full years before the HOA was incorporated. There's no deed restriction, no covenant, and no binding agreement that would give them authority." Moore was less convinced. "What about county ordinances, emergency declarations?" He gestured toward my camera setup. "And what's all this about? Seems like a lot of security for a guy who claims he's not doing anything wrong." I realized Moore might be the kind of deputy who'd rather avoid complications than dig into nuances of property law and HOA authority limits. "Deputy, I'm documenting everything because someone's been making false claims about my property and my rights. These cameras aren't pointed at anyone else's land, they're not recording audio, and they're positioned to capture anyone who comes onto my property without permission." I pulled up the timestamp logs on my laptop, showing the clear digital record of when each camera had been activated. If someone shows up claiming authority they don't have, I want proof of exactly what happened and when. Alvarez nodded approvingly as he examined my camera positioning. Smart setup, non-intrusive, focused on your own property, and configured for evidence documentation rather than harassment. What kind of unauthorized activity are you expecting? His question was professional curiosity rather than suspicious interrogation. Sergeant, I've got reason to believe someone's planning to enter my property using fabricated emergency authority. There's been reconnaissance activity, coordinated radio chatter about property inspections and pressure tactics designed to make me surrender my legal rights under the guise of community emergency response. I showed him printouts of Karen's emails and the threatening language about emergency declarations superseding property rights. At exactly 4:12 a.m. the next morning, that documentation arrived in spectacular fashion. The bells started chiming like a wind chime factory in a tornado, and all 3 cameras triggered simultaneously. 2 figures in dark clothing were approaching my front door with purposeful stealth. The infrared captured everything in perfect detail: faces, clothing, and most importantly, the small metal tools one of them was carrying. I recognized Karen's nephew Mark immediately from his distinctive gait, but the second figure was the militia-looking guy from the previous day's convoy, now dressed in all black and moving with tactical precision. I was already reaching for my phone to call 911 when they made the decision that would eventually land them in handcuffs. Instead of knocking or announcing themselves, Mark produced what looked like a small metal rod and started working on my door lock. The cameras captured every detail as he inserted what I now knew was a bump key, a specialized tool used to bypass standard pin tumbler locks. This wasn't a welfare check or emergency inspection. This was breaking and entering documented in high-definition infrared video with precise timestamps that would hold up in any courtroom. My 911 call was calm, factual, and carefully worded. This is Kevin Winters at 1247 Ridgepoint Road. I have 2 individuals attempting to break into my home using lock manipulation tools. I have video documentation of the attempt in progress. I am armed, I am inside the residence, and I am not in immediate danger, but I need law enforcement response for a burglary in progress. The dispatcher confirmed my address and advised me to stay on the line until units arrived. While I waited for law enforcement, I did something that would prove to be the masterstroke of this entire drama. I started my laptop, opened my live streaming software, and went live on social media with a multi-screen broadcast. One window showed the county plat map with my property clearly marked outside HOA boundaries. Another window displayed the live feed from my front door camera. The third window showed the time-stamped recording of Mark using the bump key. Within minutes, I had viewers from across the county watching real-time documentation of attempted breaking and entering, complete with geographic proof that the perpetrators had no legitimate authority to be on my property. The chat exploded with comments from neighbors, people sharing their own HOA horror stories, and local residents who recognized both Mark and his accomplice. Someone even identified the big guy as Troy Dunkirk, Karen's cousin, who apparently had a history of enforcement activities for various family business ventures. As the viewer count climbed past 200, I realized I'd accidentally created the most transparent criminal justice documentation in county history. Every detail was being witnessed, recorded, and archived by hundreds of people in real time, creating an evidentiary record that would be impossible to dispute or suppress. By the time Karen's convoy reached my property, I had over 800 people watching the live stream. What she had planned as a quiet middle-of-the-night operation had become the most public law enforcement response in recent county history. The snowplow she'd hired to clear the road had red and blue emergency lights reflecting off its blade, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere as sheriff's vehicles followed behind. Karen had gone full performance mode, complete with emergency blankets, supply boxes, and a megaphone to announce her humanitarian mission. She was dressed like a disaster relief coordinator with multiple layers of official-looking gear and a vest covered in patches that suggested emergency management authority. Her theatrical preparation demonstrated that she'd been planning this operation for days, possibly weeks. "There's a child trapped inside this residence," she shouted toward the cameras, clearly playing to what she thought was just a law enforcement audience. She had no idea that hundreds of people were watching her performance live, including many who knew for a fact that I lived alone with my dog. "We're here under emergency authority to conduct a welfare check and provide immediate assistance to vulnerable individuals who may be at risk." Her theatrics might have been convincing to someone who didn't know the background, but to the live stream audience who had been following this drama for hours, she was just digging her legal grave deeper with every word. The chat was exploding with comments from people who recognized her voice, knew the property history, and were documenting her false statements in real time. That's when my bear deterrent siren decided to join the party. The motion-activated alarm that I'd installed to keep wildlife away from my garbage triggered, when Karen's group approached the porch, filling the mountain air with a sound like an air raid warning mixed with a smoke detector, having an existential crisis. Rangers started howling in harmony with the siren, creating a cacophony that was both terrifying and absolutely hilarious. Karen stumbled backward, dropping her emergency blankets into the snow while Troy covered his ears and started cursing loud enough for the cameras to pick up every colorful word. Deputy Moore approached my door with his hand on his weapon, clearly rattled by the chaos. But Sergeant Alvarez took one look at the setup, immediately recognized it as a wildlife deterrent, and gestured for Moore to relax. "Mr. Winters, I'm going to need you to turn off that alarm so we can sort this out," Alvarez called out in the authoritative but not hostile tone that experienced cops use when they're trying to de-escalate. His approach demonstrated that he was treating this as an investigation rather than an emergency response. "Sergeant, I've got video evidence of 2 individuals attempting to break into my home approximately 40 minutes ago using specialized lock manipulation tools," I replied, gesturing toward my laptop where the live stream was still running. "The alarm system activated because your group triggered the same motion sensors that caught the actual crime in progress. I also have documentation proving this property is outside HOA jurisdiction." Moore was still focused on the welfare check angle. "Sir, we received reports of a child in distress at this location. We need to verify the safety of all occupants." That's when Karen made the critical mistake that would finally flip Moore from skeptical neutral to active ally. Instead of letting the deputy handle the situation professionally, she started coaching him from the sidelines, telling him where to look and what questions to ask. "Deputy, you need to understand that this man has been refusing to cooperate with community emergency protocols," Karen interrupted, stepping closer to Moore in a way that violated proper scene management. "He's been hostile to emergency responders, and we have reason to believe he may be hiding someone who needs immediate medical attention." Her coaching was so obvious and inappropriate that even Moore started to look suspicious. "Ma'am, I need you to step back and let us handle this according to proper procedure," Moore told Karen, but she was too deep into her performance to read the room. She kept insisting about the child waving her arms toward my windows, and generally acting like someone who had way too much personal investment in getting inside my house for reasons that had nothing to do with child welfare. That's when Mark made the decision that ended this entire charade. Instead of waiting for the deputies to sort out the jurisdictional issues, he pulled out his bump key again and moved toward my door, apparently thinking he could complete his original mission while everyone was distracted by Karen's theatrical welfare check performance. Moore's training kicked in immediately. "Drop what's in your hands and step away from the door now," he commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. The deputy had his handcuffs out before Mark could even process what was happening. "Sir, you're under arrest for attempted burglary and possession of burglary tools. You have the right to remain silent." The bump key hit the snow with a metallic clink that was picked up clearly by my streaming audio, and Mark's hands went behind his back with professional efficiency. Meanwhile, my live stream audience was going absolutely crazy in the chat, with comments flying past faster than I could read them, and viewer numbers climbing past 1,200. The moment that changed everything came when Alvarez examined Mark's phone, which had been buzzing with notifications throughout the entire arrest. With Mark's permission, Alvarez scrolled through the recent messages to understand who had sent him here and what organization was coordinating these activities. What he found was a group chat called Dunkirk Winter Operations, with detailed discussions about property schedules, emergency acquisition procedures, and client payment rates. The chat included photos of various properties in the area, including my cabin, with notes about occupancy status and potential rental income. It was a comprehensive criminal enterprise disguised as community service. But the real bombshell was the instruction manual Karen had shared with the group, detailing how to respond to law enforcement questions during what she called emergency acquisitions. The script included specific language about children in distress, community safety concerns, and emergency authority overrides. It was a comprehensive guide to lying to police officers, and it was sitting right there on Mark's phone for everyone to see. Alvarez looked up from the screen with the expression of a man who'd just watched someone confess to multiple felonies in writing. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come over here," he called to Karen, his tone shifting from professional courtesy to official law enforcement business. "We need to discuss some communications that appear to be related to tonight's activities." Karen's face went from confident authority figure to panicked criminal in about 2 seconds as she realized her entire operation had just been exposed. That's when I realized the live stream had captured something unprecedented. My audience hadn't just witnessed a burglary arrest, they'd watched the real-time exposure of what appeared to be an organized fraud operation targeting property owners during weather emergencies across multiple counties. The chat was filled with people sharing their own experiences, with suspicious HOA emergency declarations, questionable property inspections, and pressure to surrender properties for community use during disasters. Karen's individual power trip had accidentally exposed what looked like a much larger pattern of abuse that had been operating under the radar for months. While Alvarez continued examining Mark's phone, the evidence kept getting worse for Karen's operation. The group chat revealed a sophisticated network of properties across 3 counties, all targeted during various emergency declarations over the past 18 months. The messages included pricing schedules for what they called occupied property emergency placement, with rates significantly higher than normal vacation rentals. They were essentially running a disaster capitalism scheme using fabricated emergency authority and community pressure to force property owners into lucrative short-term rental agreements that generated maximum profit during crisis situations. The operation included research on local emergency management protocols, insurance claim procedures, and legal loopholes that could be exploited during declared emergency. The live stream had taken on a life of its own. Viewers were sharing the feed across social media platforms, and local news outlets were starting to pick up the story. Comments were flowing in from people who recognized the properties mentioned in Karen's chat logs, including several who claimed they'd been approached during previous storms with similar emergency acquisition demands. One viewer shared a photo of the same emergency shelter program sign that Karen had tried to plant in my yard, except this one was dated from a windstorm 6 months earlier and planted at a lakefront property in the next county over. Another comment included a screenshot of an identical emergency authority letter that had been used to pressure an elderly couple into surrendering their vacation cabin during a forest fire evacuation. The smoking gun came when Alvarez found Karen's instruction emails to her network of enforcers. The messages laid out a detailed strategy for targeting properties during weather events, including research on owner absence patterns, property insurance coverage, and emergency services response times. Most damning was a spreadsheet showing revenue projections for what they called crisis accommodation services, with my cabin listed as a premium location capable of generating over $3,000 per weekend. The spreadsheet included detailed financial projections for various disaster scenarios. Forest fires generated the highest rental premiums because of evacuation zones and insurance displacement claims. Blizzards were second because of transportation, disruption, and heating emergencies. The document showed sophisticated understanding of insurance fraud, emergency management manipulation, and disaster profiteering. Karen's humanitarian mask finally slipped completely when she realized how much evidence was being displayed on my laptop screen for thousands of viewers to see. "Turn that camera off immediately," she demanded, reaching toward my equipment. "This is confidential community business, and you have no right to broadcast private communications." Her admission that these were private communications rather than legitimate emergency operations was picked up by everyone listening. Deputy Moore, who had started skeptical of my security preparations, was now taking notes as fast as he could write. "Ma'am, are you saying these emergency shelter claims were not legitimate community safety operations?" His question was perfectly crafted to give Karen an opportunity to clarify her position, but she was too angry and panicked to recognize the legal trap. Instead of claiming misunderstanding or asking for a lawyer, Karen launched into a passionate defense of her right to use community resources during emergencies, completely admitting that her shelter program was actually a rental business model. "These people don't understand the financial realities of emergency management," she ranted. "Someone has to coordinate resources and ensure that property is being used efficiently during crisis situations." The HOA board meeting that night was unlike anything Black Pine Estates had ever seen. Normally, these gatherings drew maybe a dozen residents and covered topics like snow removal schedules and mailbox placement. Tonight, over 60 people packed into the community center, many carrying printouts of screenshots from my live stream and copies of the group chat messages that were now circulating through email and social media. Board members who had supported Karen's emergency powers were quietly trying to distance themselves from her methods while claiming they had no knowledge of the rental operation or criminal enforcement activities. Homeowners who had been pressured by previous inspection visits were finally speaking up about their experiences. The meeting started with 3 board members announcing their immediate resignations, followed by a motion to suspend all emergency community programs, pending a complete audit of HOA finances. Karen tried to maintain control by citing procedural rules, but the crowd was having none of her parliamentary maneuvering. One by one, residents stood up to share their stories about questionable inspections, pressure to participate in emergency programs, mysterious increases in community fees that seemed to coincide with Karen's rental network expansion, and intimidation tactics used against anyone who questioned HOA authority. Josh took the microphone and delivered what turned out to be the killing blow. "I've been tracking the properties mentioned in these chat logs, and I can tell you that most of them are owned by elderly residents or people who don't live here full-time. Karen's been specifically targeting properties where the owners couldn't fight back or wouldn't know their rights." He held up a map showing the pattern of targeted properties, all located in scenic areas, with high rental potential, all owned by people who were either absent during emergencies or vulnerable to intimidation tactics. She's been running a protection racket disguised as community service, and we've all been paying HOA fees to fund her criminal enterprise. By the end of the evening, the community had voted to dissolve the current HOA board, suspend all emergency authority protocols, and bring in an independent management company to audit the association's finances. They also voted to implement new bylaws, requiring any property inspections to be conducted with owner consent, official government authority, or a court order. The new bylaws included provisions for financial transparency, requiring monthly reports of all HOA income and expenses, mandatory recording of board meetings, and a cooling-off period before any new community policies could be implemented. The changes essentially transformed the HOA from Karen's personal fiefdom into a transparent community organization with checks and balances. Karen's final stand came in the parking lot after the meeting, where she tried to convince the few remaining supporters that the whole situation was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by social media manipulation. But even her most loyal allies were backing away, especially after someone pulled up the revenue projections from her chat logs and calculated how much money her emergency rental scheme had potentially generated. The numbers were staggering, suggesting that Karen's operation had been pulling in tens of thousands of dollars while claiming to provide humanitarian services. What made it worse was the discovery that Karen had been using HOA community funds to pay for equipment, vehicle rentals, and enforcement personnel for her private rental operation. The snowplow that had cleared the road to my cabin, the emergency supplies she'd brought, and even the tactical equipment that Troy had been wearing were all purchased with community association money. As the crowd dispersed and Karen drove away in defeat, I realized that my simple decision to document a property dispute had accidentally exposed a sophisticated criminal operation that had been victimizing the community for over a year. The live stream hadn't just protected my property rights, it had liberated an entire community from an organized fraud scheme disguised as emergency management. The federal charges came down 3 weeks later, after the FBI had time to analyze the full scope of Karen's operation and coordinate with law enforcement agencies in 6 other states where similar schemes had been reported. What started as a simple trespassing case had evolved into a multi-state investigation of wire fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, and emergency services abuse. The federal task force discovered that Karen and her network had been running what prosecutors called a sophisticated disaster capitalism scheme, using weather emergencies and fabricated community authority to generate rental income from properties they didn't own. The operation included detailed intelligence gathering on property ownership patterns, insurance coverage levels, emergency response protocols, and legal vulnerabilities that could be exploited during crisis situations. Karen faced wire fraud charges for using electronic communications to coordinate the scheme across state lines, conspiracy for organizing multiple people in federal crimes, racketeering for operating a continuing criminal enterprise, filing false police reports for the fabricated child welfare emergencies. Mark and Troy were facing additional charges for attempted break-in possession of burglary tools and participating in the broader conspiracy. The livestream footage had become crucial evidence in the federal case, providing time-stamped documentation of the attempted break-in, Karen's false statements to law enforcement, and the real-time discovery of the coordinating communications. Legal experts were calling it one of the most thoroughly documented criminal cases in recent history, with every aspect captured from multiple angles and witnessed by hundreds of people in real time. The community response following Karen's arrest was something I hadn't expected. Instead of bitter divisions that often follow neighborhood controversies, Black Pine Estates seemed to experience collective relief and renewal. People who had been isolated by Karen's intimidation tactics were reconnecting and sharing their experiences for the first time. The new HOA board, elected by overwhelming margins, implemented radical transparency requirements that transformed the community association from an authoritarian organization into a genuinely democratic institution. Monthly financial reports became public documents available to all residents. Board meetings were recorded and archived online. New community policies required majority approval from homeowners rather than arbitrary decisions by board members. More touching was the personal response from neighbors who had initially been suspicious of my security preparations. In the days after the blizzard cleared, I started finding care packages on my porch. Home-baked bread from the elderly couple down the ridge who had been targeted in Karen's early recruitment attempts. Coffee and emergency supplies from families who realized they might need similar preparation if anyone else tried to exploit community emergencies. The packages came with handwritten notes of apology and support that restored my faith in community spirit. "Thank you for standing up when the rest of us were too scared," wrote Mrs. Henderson. "I should have supported you from the beginning, but I was afraid of more fines and inspections." Her note captured the fear that Karen had been using to control the community and the relief people felt when that fear was finally lifted. Josh became something of a local hero for his pattern analysis that had exposed the geographic targeting in Karen's scheme. The county sheriff's office asked him to consult on developing new protocols for distinguishing legitimate emergency community responses from fraudulent authority claims. His work led to a regional program that helps property owners understand their rights during emergency declarations. The most meaningful change came in how the community handled future emergency situations. When a spring wildfire threatened the area 6 months later, the response was coordinated through official emergency management channels with complete transparency about resource allocation and property protection measures. Property owners were asked to volunteer their resources rather than being pressured or intimidated into compliance. Sergeant Alvarez and I developed an ongoing friendship based on our shared appreciation for preparation, documentation, and letting evidence speak for itself. He became a regular visitor during hunting season, and we often discussed how the case had changed his approach to investigating community authority disputes. The thing that impressed me most, he told me one evening, was how you never lost your temper or did anything that could be used against you later. You just documented everything and let the truth do the work. Deputy Moore eventually admitted that the case had changed his perspective on individual property rights versus community authority claims. He started recommending that property owners document any questionable community demands and verify authority before complying with requests that seemed outside normal procedures. The cabin itself became a symbol of successful resistance to community overreach, but more importantly, it remained what my grandfather had always intended it to be, a place of peace, preparation, and self-reliance. The wood stove still crackles on winter nights, Ranger still patrols the perimeter with professional dedication, and the CB radio still connects me to neighbors who now appreciate the value of independent communication systems. Karen's case became a landmark prosecution that established important precedents about community authority limits during emergency declarations and the federal implications of using weather events to facilitate fraud schemes. Her operation had victimized dozens of property owners across multiple states, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal rental income while claiming to provide humanitarian services. The investigation led to new federal guidelines for distinguishing legitimate emergency community responses from criminal exploitation of disaster situations. The Department of Justice published warnings about disaster capitalism schemes that target property owners during weather emergencies, using Karen's operation as a primary example. Karen was ultimately sentenced to 6 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to all victims of her fraud scheme. Mark and Troy received shorter sentences in exchange for their cooperation. The HOA was forced to dissolve and reform under new bylaws that included strict limitations on community authority and mandatory transparency requirements. The money that Karen had stolen through her rental scheme was recovered and returned to the community, funding improvements to legitimate emergency preparedness and communication systems. The snowplow that she had used in her fake rescue operation was sold, and the proceeds went toward a genuine emergency response fund managed by county authorities. The story that started with midnight pounding on my door became a testament to the power of preparation, documentation, and refusing to be intimidated by false authority. Sometimes the most effective resistance isn't dramatic confrontation, but simply insisting that people prove their claims and follow actual laws rather than made-up community policies. Truth, as it turns out, really is the most powerful live stream content you can create. The real victory wasn't just exposing Karen's fraud or protecting my property rights. It was demonstrating that individual citizens can effectively defend themselves against organized deception when they're prepared, patient, and committed to documenting rather than escalating conflicts. If you've ever dealt with community authority overreach, fake emergency claims, or neighbors who think HOA membership grants them police powers, drop your story in the comments below. Every experience adds to our collective understanding of how these schemes operate and how to recognize them before they escalate to criminal behavior. Hit that subscribe button for La HOA Karen Stories 88 and explore our previous episodes documenting how ordinary people expose extraordinary deception through patience and preparation. Each story reveals different tactics used by people who mistake aggression for authority and the various ways that documentation and transparency can transform dangerous situations into teachable moments. Remember to check your local property boundaries, understand your actual legal obligations versus community pressure tactics, and never let anyone convince you that emergency declarations suspend your fundamental rights. Most importantly, when someone claims authority they can't prove, make them prove it before you comply. Documentation beats intimidation every time. The mountains are quiet tonight, the snow is falling steadily, and Ranger is snoring by the fire. Sometimes the best response to chaos is simply maintaining your calm, documenting everything, and letting the truth speak for itself.